I've lived here for 20 years and still. My whole life.
Okay, now I'm feeling better about myself.
One thing I actually am good at is names of counties.
I'm better
Because
at
the bar trivia that I go to, like one of the frequent tiebreaker questions is write down as many Georgia counties as you can in a minute. And yeah, so like one of the things I do sometimes when I'm walking home and have nothing else to do is just run through them in my head,
Right.
so that I can win free beer if it comes to it. You know?
It's so funny. There's a lot more counties out here than over in Vegas.
There are.
For
It got to a point where I think that there was a state judge that, you know, so like all right, like no more new counties. you have to stop creating new counties here. And yeah, there are complicated historical reasons as to why that happens. That this is a Brit Lit class, so we're not going to get too deep into that, but it's yeah. A lot of it has to do with certain segments of certain communities not wanting to pay for services in the other side of the community.
yeah,
So, yeah.
it's weird. In Vegas, it was like all 2+ million people were in the same county. Like
Yeah.
it didn't matter where in the vicinity you were, you were still in the same county. So
Yeah, Las Vegas County. That's okay, so a couple of things just to keep in mind here. So on Friday, if you want extra credit for revising your essay, that's when that's due, right? Vocab quiz on Sunday. For Monday, you're reading one of Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories, probably actually the best known of them. Excuse me, The Adventure of the Speckled Band, which is actually totally relevant to the stuff we're going to talk about today, for reasons that will become clear when we discuss it. But just a couple reminders about extra credit things, right? You go see the monks, take a picture, that will give you extra participation points. Revise your paper, get extra credit. If you attend Dr. Evelyn Lay Espirito Gandhi's lecture tomorrow, Friday night, 5:30 on Zoom, I'll give you extra credit for that. And also next week, there's going to be a performance on campus of Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest. It's running from the 20th through the 23rd. If you attend and bring back a ticket or a program or something, just some evidence that you were there, I will give you extra credit for that as well. It's going to be in the GSW Fine Arts Theater, and it is free to anyone with a GSW ID. Right. Yes, go ahead, Ron.
The Zoom lecture, where is the Zoom code?
Okay, the Zoom, you should be able to find the link on Canes Connect.
Okay.
If you cannot find it on Canes Connect, the person to contact, because she set all this up, is Dr. Elena Kaus, and you can reach her at elenakaus@gsw.edu. And yeah, if you contact her, she should be able to either give you the link or explain to you better than I can how to get it.
Is that K-A-U-S?
K-A-U-S, yes. Which coincidentally was also the name of the national god of the Edomites, who were the people to the southwest of the biblical kingdom of Judah. Yeah, just interesting historical point. Like, you know, Dr. Kaus is not an Edomite. there are no longer any Edomites. But it's just an interesting coincidence. Okay. So I also want to let all of you know that the English department is having our fall party next week from 3 to 5. It's a Thursday on the 20th in room 202. So the one next to this. And you know, it's there will be free food. So so just, you know, feel free to come by. No one is obligated to, but if you feel like it, stop in for a little bit. Okay, so before we get into today's stuff, does anybody have any questions about anything? Well, I find what we're supposed to be talking about.
Okay, so the title of this strange man, Macaulay,
Okay.
Minute on Indian Education. I found that, like, before even reading it, I find that, like, already condescending, the minute on Indian education.
Oh, okay. So let me actually explain what is meant by that. He's
Okay.
He's not like. This is actually cut from a much longer document
Okay.
that would take, in fact, several minutes to read or recite, right? No. So by minute, he means something more like a memo.
Okay.
Right, so like meeting minutes, not like, I am only going to spend a short time thinking or discussing the subject.
Okay. Makes much more
Yeah,
sense.
yeah. So yeah, he's not trying to give this, like, whatever we think of the conclusions he comes to. He's not trying to give the subject short shrift or make it look like that's not worth thinking about. Any other questions or comments?
I thought it was interesting when it was, I'm probably about to butcher this person's name, Mukharji?
Mukharji is how you would pronounce
Okay.
it.
Mukharji. I was like, I don't know how to pronounce that. That's going to come out bad. But he was talking about, like, one that they even had, like, this exhibition thing, like, that they went to England. Like, I didn't realize that, like, people would do that. I don't know. That seems like more like it would be so difficult probably to get there that it seemed, like, strange to me that they would even have it. But then when he was talking about, like, how everyone was expecting them to not know English or any of these sorts of things, and you'd think, well, they'd probably send the ones who'd at least understand what's happening around them. If they're going to go to a different country, like, it would be strange if they just chose people who couldn't speak or understand any English. So it was just a little funny, like, strange.
Yeah. And I think one thing that we might want to pay attention to as we look at Mukherjee's piece is how he treats class distinctions in England, right? There is a little bit, like, I think, like, in some of what Mukherjee writes is kind of like comic skewering of English misconceptions about, his own country and his own people, right? But there's also a kind of residual snobbishness in there. You may have noticed that most of the people he's really taking shots at are rural people or working class people, right? Like, the things he says about the upper class people he deals with are rather different. So that's one thing that I do want to try to discuss as we get a little further into these texts. But I think, so this event that he's visiting is the Indian and Colonial Exhibition of 1886. So, to give you some sense of what this was like, have any of you ever been to Disney World? No? But you've been. Okay, so I don't know, Kaylee, did you go to Epcot Center when you were there?
I have no clue. I was like 8.
Okay. Okay, well, there's a part of Epcot Center, it's called the World Showcase. And it's all these little pavilions around a lake that are mostly sponsored by the governments of or businesses in a particular country, right? So it's all set up in a very strange way. Mexico is adjacent to Norway, for example, so the geography of it's a little bit fucked up. And it is all but you go to each pavilion and there's some information about the handicrafts of that country and their major exports. Maybe a little ride that explains their history, maybe a restaurant, right? And that's kind of like what this Indian and colonial exhibition was, except that it was solely focused on nations that were part of the British Empire. So each nation within, or each colonized nation within the empire had its own little pavilion. Now the fact that, I think it's an interesting fact to note that Indian actually has its own little designation here, right? India was one of the most economically valuable colonies that that Britain possessed, right? And there's one particular reason why it was extremely culturally important as well, right? What's the thing that we tend to think of as the British national drink?
Tea.
Yeah, I'm glad none of you said beer. Tea, yes. Tea. And where does tea come from? India, yeah. So the tea plantations in India were not only really economically important, but also very, very culturally important. Not to mention that the English had been in India for quite some time. And it was only within, about the last 30 years prior to this exhibition that they really exerted political control over the whole country. Right. Prior to that, prior to 1857, India was pretty much ruled as a fiefdom of the East India Company. And then there was a rebellion. And it was pretty bloody, and the East India Company didn't do a very good job of putting it down. So from that point on, the British Crown ruled India directly. But yeah, just to give you some sense of what this exhibition looked like. A lot of magazines of the day published illustrations, and there's a photograph of the outside of the Crystal Palace, which was the main exhibition space. Designed specially for the event. So once this comes into focus here. So this is the Crystal Palace. And the opening of this structure was a huge event in London, right? They had Alfred Tennyson, who was the poet laureate, come out and write a special poem for the occasion. The Queen was there. All kinds of dignitaries, foreign and domestic, were there, right? So it was a really big deal. And this is what some of the other outdoor and indoor spaces look like. So this is the entrance to the Indian Pavilion. It's an imitation of what's called the Jaipur Gate, which is considered one of the architectural wonders of India. And this is what a typical, this didn't come out very well, and when I try to blow it up. Let's see if shrinking it makes it even clearer. this is about what a typical pavilion would look like, right? So you've got the name of the country up above on the hustings here, and then you've got tables where people are demonstrating local handicrafts or selling goods from their country, right? Things like that.
Kind of seems like flea market-esque in a way.
Yeah, although the atmosphere is a lot more opulent than a flea market.
Right.
But yeah, there is kind of like something like a bazaar here. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, so just take a look here at this image of the crowd in the vestibule of the Crystal Palace. What do you notice here about the crowd?
What seems to be wealthy white people.
Yeah, most of the crowd seems to be fairly well dressed, or at least very respectably dressed.
Right.
White English people, right? But who do we see front and center of the crowd? How are these two guys different from everybody else?
The way they're dressed, possibly.
Mm-hmm. And what does the way they're dressed indicate about them?
They're probably not English.
Yeah, these guys are Indian. So right smack in the front of this picture, we have these two Indian gentlemen who are walking around and talking and taking in the exhibits like everyone else. And this was part of the purpose of the Indian and Colonial exhibition, right? Part of it was about a kind of like, nationalist boast, right? We are Britain. We cover more of the Earth's surface than anybody else, so our rival nations can suck it. But there's also this kind of like message of assimilating subject peoples into this larger British conglomeration, right? This idea that however differently dressed they may be, they speak different languages, their skin is a different color, their handicrafts are strange to us, right? But they are British subjects as well. So there's a kind of combination of assimilation and appropriation going on here, right? And it's really in the 19th century, partly as a result of empire, that we get the formation of a specifically British national identity, right? So let's just kind of think about that for a moment. Like, think about the word British and how being British is different from being English. What does it mean to be British? Or what does that identity include?
Living in Britain.
Yeah. And so, who would that make British?
I mean, the white wealthy people.
Well, let me put it to you that, would only English people be British? Who else would be? There are at least two other nations right on the island, right?
Are you meaning like they speak English? Does that make them English?
Like all British people are English, but not all English people are British. Like in a way.
Say that again?
It's like all British people English, but not all English people are British.
Other way around.
Okay, so all
all English people are British,
Right.
but not all British people are English.
Okay.
What's up above England? Starts with an S. Kilts, shortbread, bagpipes, Scotland, yes.
Okay.
And then what's to the west of England?
Well,
Yes. So we've got so British is an identity that in the 19th century comes to include these other nations that have been integrated into the United Kingdom politically at various points, right? So, for example, Ireland has been fully integrated into the British government, though not necessarily integrated culturally, at the beginning of the 19th century. Scotland is integrated politically with England at the beginning of the 18th century. And Wales had been politically dominated by England for centuries before that, right? Kind of like since the Middle Ages. But there was a maintenance of separate cultural identities. And the empire is a kind of connecting force that kind of transcends those national differences to a certain extent, or kind of like papers over them. And so like the idea of having an empire becomes central to the sense of Britishness, right? So this is what the British Empire looked like around 1900. So all of the red on the map is British territory. What do you notice about this? Where do the British have territory? Or where do they have where have they made territorial claims?
Northwest.
Yeah. Canada, yep.
Australia and India and big portions in Africa.
Yeah.
All of Australia.
Yeah. The whole thing, plus all the little islands around it, yeah.
They even have some in South America.
Yeah, in fact, with the exception of Antarctica, is there any continent on which there is not a British dominion?
No.
Yeah, they've got they've planted colonies everywhere, right? In fact, at its height, the British Empire covered fully 25% of the Earth's surface. Which is staggering, right? Which is enormous. And had a population of roughly 400 million people. So this is huge, right? And one thing that amuses me about this map is that it's published by a company, actually a company that still exists, that makes cookies. You can still buy McVitie's tea biscuits in any British supermarket. They come in a little roll, and they're kind of like, they're not that sweet. They're kind of like more like a biscuit kind of texture. But the ones with chocolate on one side of them are really good.
I wonder if they didn't have any colonies in Antarctica because they didn't know about it, or was it just too cold to go?
Well, more the latter. they knew it was there. In fact, I mean, Coleridge knew it was there, right? That's kind of where the Mariner's ship ends up when it gets blown off course. But yeah, nobody had explored the interior of Antarctica because yeah, it was too cold.
It's really surprising that they held on to as much land as they did for as long as they did because it was so stretched out.
Yeah, and extremely expensive. And by the end of the 19th century as well, many of these subject peoples are developing are developing or rediscovering national aspirations of their own. So while this is an enormous political structure here, right? It's also a very fragile one. And it's held together in a lot of ways by like bits of string and, you know, little pieces of rubber cement here and there. And not all of these territories are administered in the same way. Not all of them are even kind of directly governed by England. So I'll explain that distinction to you, I suppose, next. So there are three basic kinds of colonies. There are crown colonies, chartered colonies, and protectorates. So a crown colony was ruled directly from England. Jamaica, for example, was a crown colony. Right? Essentially, Parliament would appoint a governor who would then rule in Parliament's name, right? Chartered colonies were run by private corporations. For example, colonies that were set up either by the Royal Africa Company or the East India Company. In fact, the early American colonies were chartered colonies. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, for example, was run by the Massachusetts Bay Company. The Jamestown Colony was planted by a group of investors from Britain, right? Who were planting the colony to make a profit. India is a chartered colony prior to 1857 and a crown colony after 1857. And the last category, and the one that's a little bit fuzziest, are what are called protectorates. And protectorates are places where the local rulers maintain some autonomy, but gave some concessions to the British in exchange for protection, right? So if this kind of sounds a little bit like an extortion racket, it's like in a nice country you got here, it'd be a shame if something happened to it. That kind of is what it is, right? The British move in troops and, they say, well, we'll protect you if you let us, like, say, mine all of your chromium or, take all your diamonds. And so, so these protectorates emerge that are technically independent, but are actually kind of politically, economically, and socially dependent now on Britain. So, we also see across the empire kind of like very different levels of autonomy given to different colonies, right? So for example, Canada and Australia, despite being part of the empire, pretty much manage themselves. Right? They are given leave mostly to run their own affairs. Things in, say, Jamaica and India, or in South Africa, tend to be a little bit more heavy-handed. Now, why might that be? There's a pretty obvious reason as to what's going on here, but I just want to see if everybody grasps it. Why are Canada and Australia given more autonomy than Jamaica, India, South Africa, and other such colonies? What's the difference?
Is it their culture?
Culture's part of it, yeah.
They're all darker skinned. Yeah.
Basically, yeah. The populations of Canada and Australia by the 19th century are predominantly white. The indigenous people are mostly either, died off or marginalized. So yeah, because these are predominantly white settler populations, they're given a lot more leave to govern their own affairs. In fact, Canada doesn't officially declare independence from Britain until the early 1980s. And the Queen is still on their money, or I guess the King now, right? But yeah,
like how recent that is.
Yeah. Canada declaring independence is within living. Like I kind of sort of remember it, right? Seeing something on TV with the Prime Minister of Canada, shaking the Prime Minister's hand, the Prime Minister of Britain's hand, and the Queen waving at people, because that seems to be mostly what she did. But yeah, and these colonies, particularly Canada and Australia, provided a kind of safety valve for British population growth. So you remember Malthus and Scrooge channeling Malthus talking about surplus population. Well, the colonies was a way, sending people to the colonies was a way to deal with that surplus population without anyone having to starve to death, right? So that was one motive for keeping all of these colonies, right? When as the population was exploding, it gave you essentially places to offload people onto, right? But there were economic motives present as well from the beginning, and there were largely three economic motives. The first was to try to secure raw materials. The second was to try to protect trade routes, right? It's easier to defend trade routes if you control all the ports. And the third was to create new markets for British made goods. So the two texts that I had you read for today are both kind of produced at different phases of Victorian colonialism. So Macaulay is writing in the 1830s at the very beginning of the Victorian period, when India is still controlled by the East India Company and not by the Crown. Mukharji, on the other hand, is writing near the end of the period, in 1886, when Victoria is very much is an old widow with not too awful many years. I guess maybe about another 15 years to live, which I guess is still still a decent amount of time. But by that point, the Victorian age, Victoria's reign is very, very far advanced, and the size of the empire has expanded exponentially. Most of the African colonies were acquired in the 1870s, for example. So let's take a look here at Macaulay and this minute on Indian education, and see where we can detect these economic motives, and also maybe how we can connect it to previous discourses that we've talked about in this class. So let's actually start there. Was there anything that we've read before that you think you can connect this to? particular words or ideas that jump out at you?
It kind of reminds me of, believe it or not, like the Equiano with like them trying to convert them to like English ways, like the advancements, like the like it's kind of like the defamiliarization, but not really. Like they're
Okay.
trying to like convert them to be English. Like he had to speak English and he had to
Yeah.
Like assimilate into
Yeah.
his culture.
Yeah, he had to cut his hair like an Englishman. He had to dress like an Englishman, right? Yeah.
English woman.
Yeah, yeah, he married an English woman, yeah. So yeah, this kind of this push for assimilation, right? But to what extent does Macaulay seem to want to genuinely assimilate people in India into the British population? He does want them speaking English, right? Why does he want them speaking English?
Because it makes trade and whatnot easier.
Yeah, that's where he tips his hand towards the end of this, right? Remember, right, like in addition to being an academic historian and a member of parliament, he's also on the corporate board for the East India Company, right? So, if we look on page 687, right? In India, English is the language spoken by the ruling class. It is spoken by the higher class of natives at the seats of government. It is likely to become the language of commerce throughout the seas of the East. It is the language of the two great European communities which are rising, the one in the south of Africa, the other in Australasia. Communities which are every year becoming more important and more closely connected with our Indian Empire. Whenever we look at whether we look at the intrinsic value of our literature or the particular situation of this country, we shall see the strongest reason to think that, of all foreign tongues, the English tongue is that which would be the most useful to our native subjects. So we can think of this, he's almost constructing here a kind of Indian Ocean trade triangle, right? Which includes India, South Africa, and Australia. And if we can connect the English-speaking people in these colonies, he's reasoning, right? That makes commerce for the East India Company a lot easier, right? So yeah, a big part of his issue here is trade, right? Making trade easier. Trade gets easier, you make more money. But where do we see other motivations here as well? Like what is the basic argument here over?
You talked about on page 686
Uh-huh.
how there was a quote, intrinsic superiority of the Western literature, and like how he
There's
was
a lot of that kind of thing, yeah.
Yeah, and how he was kind of like, well, they'll learn more if they learn it from our texts than maybe what they would learn from their own. Like this idea that like if it was English, like it must be better.
Yeah.
This is like all kind of not
Uh-huh.
really, but it's just funny how he's saying like, oh, our language is correct, but he says I have no knowledge of either.
Yeah, that's a really good catch.
Yeah.
That he's dismissing the value of Sanskrit and Persian, which he consistently calls Arabic, right? Despite admitting that he can't read either of these languages. So he's relying on someone else's opinion, right? In order to form what he believes to be an accurate assessment here, right? And whose opinions is he consulting?
Other Britons, men at home, with he said that are proficient in the Eastern tongues.
Yes. So he's consulting other Europeans, right, proficient in the Eastern tongues, and what do we call what else does he call these people, these European men who are proficient in Eastern tongues and Eastern cultures?
The members of the committee who support the Oriental Plan of Education.
The Orientalists.
Orientalists, yes. He's consulting scholars who study Asian cultures, right? And after he gets their opinion, his conclusion is, well, compared to British culture, Indian culture clearly isn't worth that much, right? So I want to kind of discuss one of those moves in a moment, right, that he's making here. But I think it's interesting to note here the change in attitude that we see from the Romantic Orientalists, right, who were largely kind of taking things from Indian culture, right? You remember, for example, how that in that Letitia Elizabeth Landon poem, right, she's taking an Indian ceremony and using it to make a point about British marriage, right? Thomas Daniel, in his introduction to the Picturesque Journey book, talks about the guiltless spoliations of scholars and artists, right? We're coming to India and we're taking stuff away, right? Macaulay, instead, is arguing that India doesn't have anything to give us. Rather, that the British are the ones who need to be giving to India, whether they want it or not, right? So he's kind of changing the direction of exchange here. Right? Rather than taking inspiration or information from Asia, we're simply going to kind of we're going to share our quote-unquote superior knowledge and culture with them, right?
Right. And he says that their books that are written in Sanskrit and Arabic are less valuable than the books that they use for preschool in Britain.
Yeah. And this is a classic Orientalist move, right? What he's doing here is suggesting that the British, right, are concerned with things like historical accuracy, right? So the British are objective, fact-oriented, mature, and serious, right? Whereas by comparison, he suggests that Indians are more subjective in their values, more imaginative, and basically childish, right?
Who was the other guy that was doing, I think we were still in the Romanticism, that were doing something quite like this? He wrote, when he went to India, and he was talking about why can't I remember?
The artist one?
Which one?
Was it the artist?
I think so. We talking about the scientist, named it.
Yeah. And yes, so Thomas Daniel, right?
Yes.
So we were just talking about him a minute ago, yeah. But I think this is comparable to what Daniel's doing, but again, I think the direction in which Macaulay is moving is different, right? Daniel is kind of more, we can appropriate these things and incorporate them into British art and British culture in some way. And Macaulay is arguing it's that the people of India have nothing of value to give us, right? That instead we should take it upon ourselves to give to them. And in doing so, just happen to teach them in a language that is also advantageous to our trade relationships. Right? Out of the goodness of our hearts. So at least the first half of this is an example of what comes to be called white man's burden rhetoric. And this comes from a poem by Rudyard Kipling that is actually, I didn't assign it to you, it's in our books here. So let's actually just take a minute and have a look at that. It's on page 970. And I think we see in Kipling a similar kind of attitude to what we see in Macaulay. Right? So Kipling writes, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. Take up the white man's burden in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride, by open speech and simple, and 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain." And so there's several more stanzas of this, right? But I think we can kind of get the basic idea from the beginning of the poem, right? So what is this white man's burden as Kipling expresses it? How might we define this?
Is it almost like they're putting in work to spread their ideas? Like, as in,
Yeah.
it's to benefit the others in a way?
Yeah, it's like, yeah, right. The idea here, right, is that the British work hard and sacrifice to give to the rest of the world.
So put upon.
I know.
You're so put upon.
And do these people to whom they're giving so much even appreciate it? They just throw things at you and tell you to go home, right?
I just recently watched The Color Purple, which is not British literature, obviously, but it's kind of, it has a theme of the white man's burden.
So what was it?
The Color Purple.
Okay.
Yes, in there, one of the mayor's wife, she made a comment. She was like, "I've always been so good to you, colored people. I've done nothing but help you."
Mhm.
And like through the movie, she's like, "Yeah, we gotta throw a charity benefit for those little black kids in the neighborhoods."
Uh-huh.
You know, she's giving back so much, but then she wants all of them to come work for her at the same time.
Yeah, it's the same idea,
Yeah.
right? It's like, I sacrifice so much for all of you. Like, why don't you appreciate it or reciprocate, right? So yeah, so it's a way to try to paint the colonial mission as humanitarian, right? Rather than as a form of economic and military dominance, right? You add some kind of humanitarian element. I think we can kind of we can tie this back as well. You remember the Claudius Buchanan piece where he's talking about the Rath Yatra, the Jagannath festival in northern India, and misrepresenting and misunderstanding it on the one hand, right? But also his larger goal is to make an argument for increased missionary activity, which the East India Company didn't allow in India, to try to again bring them to the basic light of Britishness, right? Make them more like us. So the idea here is that we're trying to give them something good and they don't even want it, right? Now, a reasonable person might say, it's like, okay, if they don't want what I'm selling, I'm going to go home, right? No reason to fight over this. But the economic motives tend to override everything else, right? The humanitarian motives are often kind of used as cover for the economic motives.
Right.
Although the two do get kind of mixed up and confused at various points in history and in literature, right? And one thing that it's probably useful to do as we're reading Victorian texts generally, right? So most of them don't directly mention colonialism or the empire, right? But if you're reading something like, say, Pride and Prejudice, and you're wondering, well, how does Mr. Darcy have this nice estate and all this money, but he's never worked a day in his life? Right? This is why, right? This is where the money's coming from. So there's a group of critics, mostly of Indian descent or Arabic descent, people like Gayatri Spivak and Edward Said. And I realized that I forgot to give you a bibliography today, so I'll make sure I have that for you on Monday. But yeah, they suggest a reading technique that they call contrapuntal reading. So the term is taken from music. Don't you know what counterpoint is in music? Okay, I'll take your generalized silence to mean no. So a counterpoint is kind of a melody that's played like alongside the main melody, right? But kind of underneath it.
Okay.
It's a slightly like a submerged melody, right? So contrapuntal reading is a way of rereading canonical texts from the perspective of a colonized person in order to highlight submerged voices. So, you would read a novel like Pride and Prejudice, or, Jane Eyre, or, kind of one of these classic 19th century novels, from the perspective of a marginalized person, a person who was kind of like marginalized in British culture. And we're probably going to try some of that when we read The Speckled Band for next time, right? Because it actually does make some not so very oblique connections between Britain and India. Yeah. So let's move on to Mukharji, who is looking at British culture as a kind of outsider. So I guess one of the things that I find most entertaining about this piece is the way he messes with English people who he meets, right, who have all of these kind of preconceived notions that are inaccurate about his culture. Like if we look on page 702, the number of wives we left behind at home was also a constant theme of speculation among them, and shrewd guesses were sometimes made on this point, 250 being a favorite number. You could tell any amount of stories on this subject without exciting the slightest suspicion. Once, one of our number told a pretty waitress, "I am awfully pleased with you, and I want to marry you. Will you accept the 40th wifeship in my household, which became vacant just before I left my country?" She asked, "How many wives have you altogether?" 250, the usual number. What was the ready answer? "What became of your wife number 40? I killed her because one morning she could not cook my porridge well." So, he's bullshitting this guy, right? But he's doing this because this is what he's hearing people saying about himself and his people walking around the exhibition, right? He's finding out that the British have all these notions about India that are often kind of based on stories, right? So I think the 250 wives and the violent treatment of them is based largely on the popularity of a collection of Arabic fairy tales called The 1001 Nights, right? Which is everybody more or less familiar with this collection of stories?
Is it the same as the Arabian Night?
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
It's the same thing. Yeah, yes, it's the same text. Yeah, but yeah. So this was hugely popular in 19th century Europe, and also really kind of colors people's perceptions of what, like, these are medieval stories, right?
Right.
But they color people's perceptions in the 19th century of what the Middle East and South Asia are like. So, one other thing that we do need to note about Mukherjee as well is that he is writing for two audiences. So on the one hand, he is writing for newspapers back home in India that are publishing his dispatches, more or less as they happen. But he's also collecting these to be published in book form. To be sold in Britain. So what does that mean then in terms of how he has to deal with audience?
He has to write it to where it was suit both. Like he can't like blatantly insult the people of Britain.
Yeah, he can't just, well, the British are all a bunch of pigs and screw every last one of them, right? He can't do that, right?
Yeah.
But he has to give enough examples of kind of like Indian cleverness defeating British ignorance, right? To entertain his audience back home as well, right? So how does he thread that needle? Does he behave equally mockingly to all British people? I think we kind of talked about this a little bit at the beginning of class.
No, he's it's mostly like the middle class people they come to contact with.
Yeah, there's another kind of entertaining episode here I want to look at here that I think will help us with this, right? If we look on page 704. Can somebody read for us the paragraph that starts, "If we were interesting beings in the eyes of the Londoners"? Yeah, go ahead, Ron.
Okay. If we were interesting beings in the eyes of the Londoners who had oftener opportunities of seeing their fellow subjects from the Far East, how much more would we be so to the simple villagers who came by thousands to see the wonders of the exhibition? Their conduct towards us was always kind and respectful. They liked to talk to us, and whenever convenient, we tried to satisfy their curiosity. Men, women, and children whose relations are in India, serving as soldiers or in any other capacity, would come through the crowd, all panting, to shake hands with us and ask about their friends. Many queer incidents happened in this way. "Do you know Jim, James Robertson, you know of, Regiment?" asked a fat elderly woman who one day came bustling through the crowd and took me by storm without any of those preliminary maneuvers usually adopted to open a conversation with a stranger. I expressed my regret in not having the honor of Jim's acquaintance. The good old lady then explained to me that she was Jim's aunt and gave me a long history of her nephew and the circumstances which led to his enlistment as a soldier. If the truant nephew lost the golden opportunity of sending through us his dutiful message to his aunt, she on her part was not wanting in her affectionate remembrances of him. Among other things, most of which I did not understand, for she did not speak the English we ordinarily hear, nor was her language quite coherent at the time. She begged me to carry to Jim the important intelligence that Mrs. Jones, that pig, obtained a prize at the Smithfield Agricultural Show. I used my alacrity to carry the message right off to Jim in the wilds of Upper Burma. by immediately taking leave of the lady who joined her friend and explained to them that I was a bosom friend of her nephew.
Okay.
Whole time he said he did not know Jim.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, on the one, so what's the basic misunderstanding that the aunt, on the part of the aunt here? What does she not seem to grasp?
He doesn't know who she's talking about.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, so, okay, well, you're from India.
Right.
My nephew Jim is in India serving as a soldier, right?
So
Obviously, you must
know
know
each other.
him, right? So no concept of the size of India
Right.
or of its population, right?
And then it's the fact that he hurried away from her, like, yeah, I'm going to tell him, like, right now. I'm going to tell him.
Yeah, he just kind of bolts away, right?
Right.
And yeah, the aunt is also kind of assuming
Yeah.
friendly relationships
Right.
between British soldiers and Indian subjects, right?
Like, everyone just gets along.
Yeah. That everything's all peachy keen hunky dory, right?
Right.
But what else does he? What is uncomfortable about Mukherji's language regarding the old lady, though?
He's saying she has horrible English.
Yeah, he's making fun of her speech, right?
Right.
It's one of those rural dialects that I'm not accustomed to hearing, right? And pardon?
Oh, and he like calls her fat and like
Yeah.
elderly and like makes it seem like she's lost her mind and that she's the
Yeah.
most strange creature anyone's ever seen in their life. you know?
Yeah, and I mean, like her behavior might be kind of rude, right?
Right.
But he really kind of plays that up as well.
Yeah.
So so this is the kind of character, right, that will be amusing to both an Indian audience that wants to laugh at British people acting stupid, and to an upper to upper middle class British audience who want to laugh at the foibles of the people who are socially below them, right? So there is a kind of punching down here that happens that I think is a little bit uncomfortable. But yeah, but I think that this is one of the ways in which he's trying to thread the needle between these two different audiences.
Yeah.
But go ahead, Ron.
I think it's also funny the way like the encounter started. How he said that she just walked up and grabbed him and started talking.
Yeah.
And she didn't even bother with all the normal maneuvers you do when approaching
Yeah,
a
this
stranger.
assumption of familiarity, right? Yeah.
Yeah, you just walk
Yeah.
up to it and grab him and start talking.
I wonder too how much of that was also because it said like they said it's simple villagers, but honestly, if someone lived in a really rural area, there's
Yeah.
probably not many people around. You probably do know everybody who's around you. So from your perspective, you might feel like, well, the world at large, like if you're in the general area, you must know them, you know. So it's a different
Yeah.
thing too of just like. For her, that might have been a cultural thing. Like, oh yeah, of course you would know them. You know,
Sure.
it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I moved here from DC, so it's like I knew most of my immediate neighbors, right? But there's no way that I knew everybody who lived in the city, right? Or in the Delmarva area. It's yeah. So like you don't walk around like if you live in a big city. You don't walk around just saying hi to everybody because one, it would be exhausting, right? And two, like there's no possible way you can have a personal connection with everybody around you.
Right.
But yeah, like I moved here, and suddenly like everybody was saying, like everybody I ran into in the street said hello, whether they knew me or not. And it was weird. It took some getting used to.
It's so funny because that's like when my parents moved up north, they were like, oh, hello, and everyone up there is looking at them like, why are you talking to me?
Yeah.
I'm so confused.
Out in the West, it's like, okay, who is this person? Why are they near me? I don't know them. They're a creep. Like, get out of there. They're probably coming for something bad. You know?
There are different standards of politeness depending on kind of what kind of place you live in. Sure. But yeah, I think what was I going with? So I think one thing also to keep in mind here with Mukherji is we kind of go back to this concept. Like I think you mentioned Equiano a while ago, right? If we go back to this concept of alterity, right? This idea of like constantly being aware of your own otherness, right? I think we can see some evidence of this in Mukherji's writing, right? Like, for one, like how frequently does he approach anyone for a conversation?
Not once. I think when he sat at the table, he came over to the table with the family at that restaurant. But I think that was like the only time
Yeah.
he mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and he has to wait for an opening too, right? You know, once the girl makes it clear that she wants to talk to him,
Right.
he comes up, introduces himself, and they talk, right? And it's a largely friendly but also kind of uncomfortable conversation because I think, as we noted earlier, it's clear that the family doesn't understand that there's a difference between Indian and West Indian, right?
Right.
They talk about the West Indian band that they thought was so good. It's like, oh, your people are very talented. And it's like, oh, well, those aren't my people. But okay, right? So, like, even the people who are friendly to him, right, are still often constantly making him aware of his own otherness.
Right.
And, like, they're interested in him because of his otherness, right? Even the upper class people, where he forms part of the family party and people will come and, seek him out, right? Are they seeking him, there's that doubt there, right? Are they seeking me out because they like me? Or are they seeking me out because I'm different from what they're used to and I add a touch of novelty to their social lives? So I think that's just kind of something to be conscious of when we read a text like this,
Right.
that it's written directly from the perspective of a colonial subject, right? Who's come to visit the metropolis. So I know we started a few minutes early. You look like you're about to say something, Kaylee.
Oh, I was reading that little section with that girl again, and then it's interesting the way that he describes her almost exactly like they describe him. He calls her the little curiosity. So it's like either way you go, both of them were like, you're so interesting because we don't know. So it is like, I think sometimes it is that otherness that's interesting, but it worked both ways.
Yeah.
I just saw it and was like, oh, that's kind of funny.
Yeah. Yeah, I think he means curiosity here in two senses, right? Like one, the little curiosity, like because she is curious, right? But also because she is as strange to him as he is to her. Yeah. I think that's a good catch. All right. Anything else anybody wants to say about any of this?
I know I mentioned earlier like how I said it seemed like reading this, it seemed like I could have wrote it. Like from my experience growing up in rural Georgia. Yeah, like she said, rereading that, like people being so like fascinated with the way that I could speak proper English. I'm not using like broken English or AAB, and they're just curious, and they're calling people over to hear how I speak. Oh, he has manners, and he knows how to speak and form sentences. Like, wow, look at him. It's like, okay, nice to meet you too.
It's like, this isn't actually weird.
Calling people over to look at me and listen to me. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I also thought it was funny how he's like finds an annoyance in like even the girl he was talking to. He was like Minnie, Jane, or Lizzie, or whoever she might be. And then he says to brag among her less fortunate relations for 6 months to come to her of her having actually seen and talked to a genuine blackie. Like when he said that, I was like, oh my goodness. Like, it just kind of shows his perspective of actually what their intentions are. Like just to spread the word that she was able to talk to somebody.
Yeah. I mean, it's he can't not be suspicious, right?
Mm-hmm.
She may be genuinely interested, but it might also he's also thinking, well, this also might be a way for her to play a little game of social one-upmanship, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, it's good.
It's interesting how that really doesn't change much today. Maybe the people that you do it to, but like you see like celebrities and like people are like, oh my gosh, I want to go meet them, and then they're like, oh yeah, they start like name dropping people in conversation. And like, you probably saw them like for 2 seconds, like I don't know.
The encounter meant more to you than it did today. All right, so let me give you the guide questions for next time. I'll be reading, as I said, one of these Sherlock Holmes mysteries. And Dr. Jacobs in the biology department has assured me that the actual events in the story are, from an animal perspective, completely impossible.